What if I told you that one of the most famous con men in modern history wasn't a hardened criminal in his 30s, wasn't a mafia genius, and wasn't even old enough to legally drink? What if the man who fooled banks, airlines, hospitals, and even the legal system was just a teenager? He wore a pilot's uniform, walked through airports like he owned the skies, claimed to be a doctor in a hospital, pretended to be a lawyer in courtrooms, and while the world admired the confidence, he was cashing fake checks and building one of the most audacious fraud sprees in American history. Before Hollywood turned his story into Catch Me If You Can, before millions knew his name, Frank Abagnale Jr. was already becoming a legend built on lies. A teenage runaway with charm, nerve, and an almost supernatural ability to manipulate trust. But behind the glamour of the disguises, behind the thrill of the deception, was a deeper story. A story about family collapse, identity, loneliness, and a boy who discovered that in America, if you looked the part, people rarely asked questions. This is the unbelievable true story of Frank Abagnale Jr., the check fraud mastermind, the teenage con man who fooled the world. Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born on April 27, 1948, in Bronxville, New York. At first glance, his childhood looked almost ideal. He grew up in a respectable family. His father, Frank Abagnale Sr., was a businessman. His mother, Paulette, was elegant, charming, and much younger than her husband. To outsiders, they looked successful, stable, refined, and for a time, they were. Young Frank adored his father. By many accounts, Frank Sr. was charismatic, smooth, and deeply influential in his son's life. He knew how to talk to people, how to carry himself, how to command a room. Those traits would leave a permanent imprint on the boy watching him. But inside the Abagnale household, cracks were forming. The marriage began to deteriorate. Arguments became more frequent. Tension became impossible to ignore. And then came the event that would shape Frank Jr. forever. His parents divorced. For many children, divorce is painful. For Frank, it was devastating. He was reportedly forced into an impossible emotional position, caught between his mother and father, between loyalty and confusion, between the family he knew and the family that was falling apart. Some versions of the story suggest he ran away soon after the divorce. Others indicate he drifted emotionally before he physically left. But what is clear is that the collapse of his home life became the emotional fracture line in everything that followed. A teenager with pain, a teenager with resentment, a teenager desperate to escape humiliation and reinvent himself. And soon, he would learn something dangerous. In the adult world, appearances were currency, and if you could imitate success, you could borrow power. Frank Abagnale Jr.'s criminal career did not begin with airline uniforms or glamorous impersonations. It began small, almost ordinary. As a teenager, his father reportedly gave him access to a credit card for gas purchases and basic expenses. For most teens, that would have been a privilege. For Frank, it became an opportunity. According to the story often told, he found a simple scam. He would use the card at gas stations, then convince attendants to give him cash, or manipulate transactions by inflating purchases and receiving kickbacks through staged arrangements. It was an early lesson in exploitation. Not high-level fraud, not genius-level counterfeiting, just a teenager testing the system and discovering that systems can be bent. And that discovery is crucial, because many great con artists don't begin with brilliance. They begin with a small success, a moment where the lie works, a moment where authority doesn't notice, a moment where the world fails to punish deception quickly enough. That first taste is intoxicating. For Frank, it wasn't just about money.
It was about control. At home, life was chaos. His family was fractured. His identity was unstable. But in fraud, he could decide the rules. He could create the version of himself he wanted others to believe. And when his early schemes became risky, he did what many future con artists do. He disappeared. He ran. Not just from home, not just from consequences. He ran towards reinvention. And in the years ahead, Frank Abagnale Jr. would transform from a teenage runaway into something far more dangerous, a professional liar.
Imagine being 16 years old, alone, broke, and trying to survive in cities full of adults. No stable home, no real job, no safety net. Frank wasn't just escaping, he was improvising. And survival, when mixed with charm and desperation, can become something unpredictable. He was young-looking, too young, in fact. That created a problem. Adults didn't take teenage boys seriously. Banks didn't trust them. Employers didn't hire them for meaningful roles. Women didn't necessarily see authority in them. So Frank did something bold. He aged himself. He reportedly altered his appearance, dressed older, carried himself with confidence, and learned a rule that would define his entire criminal career. People believe uniforms. People believe titles. People believe confidence. Not because they're foolish, but because modern society runs on assumptions. A pilot uniform means trust. A doctor's coat means competence. A lawyer's title means intelligence. Frank understood something terrifyingly simple. If he could look official, most people would stop asking if he was legitimate. That insight would become his superpower. And it all centered around one thing: checks. Before digital banking, before instant verification, paper checks were everywhere. They were easy to pass, harder to verify quickly. And when paired with a believable identity, they became weapons. Frank began refining what would become his signature specialty: check fraud. Forged checks, altered checks, counterfeit checks, manipulated payroll checks, bank drafts passed under false identities. He wasn't merely stealing money. He was exploiting trust embedded in institutions. And soon, he would realize there was one disguise that opened more doors than almost any other: a commercial airline pilot. This is the part of the story that made Frank Abagnale legendary. Not because it was his only scam, but because it was so outrageous that it felt impossible. Somehow, a teenage runaway managed to impersonate an airline pilot, and not just any pilot, a Pan Am World Airways pilot. In the 1960s, Pan Am was not just an airline, it was prestige, luxury, international sophistication, the future of travel. Its pilots were symbols of status. If you wore that uniform, people didn't just trust you, they admired you. According to the widely repeated account, Frank obtained a pilot uniform and learned about a little-known airline practice called deadheading. Deadheading allowed airline crew members to ride free in passenger seats when traveling to another destination for work assignments. Frank allegedly used this loophole brilliantly. He would pose as a Pan Am pilot needing transport, flash confidence, speak the language of aviation just enough to sound legitimate, and board flights for free. Think about that for a moment. A teenager, crossing countries and sometimes continents, not as a stowaway, not sneaking aboard, but walking openly through airports as an honored professional. It was audacious, it was theatrical, and it was effective. But the free flights were not the real prize. The real prize was credibility. Airports gave him access to movement. Movement gave him fresh locations. Fresh locations gave him new banks. New banks meant new victims. This is what made Frank so difficult to catch. He was mobile. He didn't stay in one city long enough for suspicion to harden. By the time one bank raised concerns, he could be in another state or another country.
The pilot persona also created a psychological shield. Who questions a pilot? Who tells a uniformed airline officer, "Wait, are you really who you say you are?" Most people don't. And that is the dark genius of impersonation. The lie doesn't just convince, it discourages scrutiny. While enjoying hotels, attention, and access, Frank was reportedly passing fraudulent checks across multiple jurisdictions. Each successful deception made him bolder. Each escape made him feel untouchable. He wasn't just stealing money anymore. He was becoming addicted to identity itself. And the pilot role wasn't enough, so he escalated. If he could be a pilot, why not a doctor? If the pilot impersonation sounds unbelievable, what came next sounds even more absurd. Frank Abagnale Jr. reportedly posed as a doctor. Specifically, one version of the story claims he worked in a Georgia hospital under the alias of a physician or supervising medical professional. Now pause. This is where the story moves from glamorous fraud to something deeply disturbing. Because pretending to be a pilot while sitting in a passenger seat is one thing. Pretending to be a doctor in a hospital, that could have cost lives. According to accounts, Frank was careful not to perform actual medical procedures. He allegedly positioned himself in administrative or supervisory roles and avoided direct treatment whenever possible. But even if that is true, the deception itself is chilling. A hospital is a place where people surrender themselves to trust. They trust the badge, the coat, the title. And once again, Frank exploited exactly that. He reportedly observed, listened, copied language, mirrored behavior, and stayed just believable enough. That was his method. Not deep expertise, not real knowledge, just enough surface performance to trigger other people's assumptions. That's what makes con artists so dangerous. They don't always need mastery. They need timing, confidence, and a system that assumes legitimacy. But Frank's hospital chapter also reveals a pattern. His cons weren't always sustainable. They were often temporary. He entered a role, absorbed the status, extracted the benefits, and left before reality could fully test him. That's not genius in the traditional sense. That's agility. It's the criminal version of staying one step ahead of verification. And still, he wasn't finished. Because somehow, the teenage con man would go even further. He would become a lawyer.
By now, Frank had already built a pattern. Enter a prestigious profession, look the part, learn the language, avoid deep scrutiny, move on before collapse. But the law? That seemed almost impossible. And yet, one of the most famous claims in Frank Abagnale's story is that he passed the Louisiana bar exam and worked, briefly, in a legal office under a false identity. If true, it is one of the most astonishing elements of the legend. A young man with no law degree, with no legitimate professional training, navigating the legal world through deception and quick learning. Even the claim itself has fueled decades of fascination. Was it exactly as dramatic as popularly told? Were parts exaggerated over time? Did memory and myth reshape the details? Those questions matter, because Frank Abagnale's life exists in a strange place between documented fraud and self-crafted legend. And that is part of what makes this story so powerful. He didn't just con banks, he eventually helped shape the mythology of his own con artistry. Still, whether every profession was impersonated exactly as later dramatized or not, the core truth remains undeniable. He committed extensive fraud. He used false identities. He exploited institutional trust, and he did it while astonishingly young. That youth is critical because people often imagine master fraudsters as older, experienced, carefully educated criminals. Frank shattered that image. He was improvisational, charismatic, fast, and psychologically fearless. Or maybe psychologically detached, because to lie this often, to become this many people, you eventually stop asking who you really are. And the law was never going to protect him forever.
because by now, banks across America were noticing patterns. Authorities were connecting dots, and a man named Joseph Shea was closing in. Frank Abagnale Jr. had one enormous advantage: jurisdictional chaos. In the 1960s, communication between banks, states, and international authorities was far slower than today. No instant digital alerts, no national fraud databases updating in seconds, no live account verification at every terminal. That delay was his oxygen. A fraudulent check could be cashed in one place, and before the alarm spread, Frank could already be gone. But the pattern was growing too large. Too many fake checks, too many aliases, too many sightings. The case eventually drew the attention of the FBI, and one of the names most associated with the pursuit is Joseph Shea, the FBI agent later linked to the Abagnale manhunt in popular retellings. Whether every detail of their cat-and-mouse relationship unfolded exactly as later dramatized is debated, but what matters is this: the walls were closing in. Frank had become bold, too bold, and that's the paradox of successful fraud. The better you get at deceiving people, the more you start believing your own invincibility. He had impersonated authority figures, crossed borders, manipulated banks, built identities out of costumes and confidence. But every con leaves a trail. Every forged check creates evidence. Every alias multiplies risk. Every success breeds carelessness. Soon, authorities began coordinating internationally, and Frank's mobility, once his greatest weapon, became harder to sustain. Because there are only so many countries to run to, only so many hotels to disappear into, only so many fresh faces before the pattern catches up. Eventually, Frank Abagnale Jr. was arrested in France in 1969. The teenage conman who had outrun institutions had finally run out of road. But the punishment waiting for him would be far harsher than the glamorous legend suggests. Frank's arrest in France was not the triumphant Hollywood finale people might imagine. There was no dramatic wink to the camera, no stylish exit, no applause for genius, just consequences. He was imprisoned in France, then reportedly transferred through legal processes involving other countries, including Sweden, before eventually being returned to the United States. The international fraud spree that once looked glamorous now looked exactly what it was: a criminal collapse. And prison strips away mythology. No uniform, no false title, no easy confidence in hotel lobbies or airport terminals. Just a man forced to sit with himself. That may have been the first truly unavoidable confrontation of Frank Abagnale's life. Who was he when there was no one left to fool? Eventually, he served time in the United States as well. But what happened next is one of the strangest twists in true crime history. Because Frank Abagnale Jr. would not remain known only as a criminal. He would reinvent himself again, this time as an expert. After prison, Frank Abagnale Jr. did something few people ever manage. He transformed his criminal knowledge into legitimate value. Over time, he became known as a consultant, lecturer, and fraud prevention expert. He advised businesses. He spoke publicly about scams. He built a reputation in security and financial crime awareness. To many people, this was redemption. A criminal turned teacher, a deceiver turned protector, a con man helping institutions close the loopholes he once exploited. And in fairness, that transformation is compelling. There is genuine value in learning from former offenders, especially when they understand weaknesses from the inside. But Frank's post-crime life also added another layer to the mystery. Because his story became not just history, it became brand. Books, interviews, public speaking, television appearances, and eventually global fame. Then came the Hollywood adaptation, Catch Me If You Can, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank Abagnale Jr. and Tom Hanks as the FBI agent pursuing him. The film turned Frank into something larger than life. Charming, fast-talking, stylish, lonely, almost lovable. And that is where the real-world discomfort begins. Because when crime becomes entertainment, truth can blur. Audiences fall in love with the performance. They admire the nerve. They celebrate the escape. But real fraud isn't charming to the victims. A fake check can ruin businesses. A false identity can destroy trust. Institutional deception has real costs. Frank's story is thrilling, yes, but it is also a reminder that charisma can disguise harm. And perhaps the most fascinating part of all is that even after his crimes ended, people still debate the exact truth of some of his most famous claims. Did every impersonation happen exactly as told? Were some stories embellished over time? Did the legend outgrow the documented facts? That uncertainty is strangely fitting, because Frank Abagnale Jr.'s greatest skill was never just forging checks. It was controlling belief. Why did Frank Abagnale Jr.'s story shock the world so deeply? Because it attacked something fundamental. Not just banks, not just businesses, not just the law. It attacked trust itself. His crimes exposed a painful truth. Society often rewards appearance faster than substance. A uniform can override doubt. A title can silence questions. Confidence can substitute for competence, at least temporarily. And Frank understood that long before most people did. He didn't use weapons. He didn't force doors open. He didn't need brute strength. He weaponized assumptions. He exploited the human instinct to trust symbols of authority. That's what makes this case so unforgettable. He wasn't just a thief. He was a mirror showing how easily institutions can be manipulated when image outruns verification. And perhaps that is why his story still fascinates people decades later, not because we admire fraud, but because deep down, it terrifies us. If one teenage runaway could fool so many people, what else are we trusting without really checking?
Frank Abagnale Jr. became famous as the teenage con man who fooled the world. A runaway boy who turned confidence into currency. A fraudster who slipped into the costumes of power. A check scammer who became a global legend. But behind the legend is a cautionary tale about how broken identity can become dangerous, about how pain can mutate into manipulation, about how society can be dazzled by surface-level authority. And maybe the most unsettling lesson of all is this. Frank didn't succeed because he was invisible. He succeeded because people saw exactly what they expected to see. A pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, a professional, and they stopped looking deeper. So the next time someone seems too polished, too confident, too perfect, remember the teenage con man who fooled the world. Because sometimes the most dangerous frauds don't hide in shadows. They walk straight through the front door, wearing a smile. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because on this channel, we uncover the world's most shocking frauds, scams, crimes, and the dark truths behind them. And tell me in the comments, was Frank Abagnale Jr. a genius or just a lucky liar in a system built on trust? Until next time, stay curious and question everything.